Welcome to Section 5 of the Introduction to the Economy of Saudi Arabia and the Other GCC Countries. My name is Eric William Wellstram. This section is titled Domestic Energy Usage and Power Production. If you have not already done so, please see Section 0 for the purpose, outline, and disclaimer of this presentation. Energy consumption is in fact the biggest, or one of the biggest, economical challenges for Saudi Arabia and the GCC countries. This is one of the most interesting facts I've learned since I got here. I always believe that you always use the thinking of the GCC as an area awash with energy, and yeah, they don't really have that big populations. I never really thought that energy consumption would be a problem. The fact is that Saudi Arabia, I'll use that as an example again, consumes roughly 30% of their oil and gas production, or total production, domestically. In 2010, they used roughly 2.4 million barrels per day of oil. If you include gas as oil equivalents, the figure is roughly 3.2. These numbers are a little bit different than we might have heard other places. They're different sources. Like I said, it's all Aramco. We don't always know exactly. Depends a little bit what you're using, but roughly speaking, the numbers are correct, and this is an introduction. Again, also 30% is, of course, only an approximate number. Why is this such a big problem for Saudi Arabia? Number one, they're completely dependent on oil and gas revenues for exports. Number two, they are also completely dependent on oil and gas to fund to drive their economic diversification. If you remember in the previous section, we talked about petrochemicals, we talked about aluminium, fertilizer. Basically, all industry being set up in the GCC countries are dependent on cheap oil and gas feedstocks and cheap electricity or cheap other sources of energy. It's also very important from a social stability point of view. The population here is very used to having, cheap gas for their cars, cheap electricity, and changing that in a post-Arab Spring. I'm not going to sort of call it a post-Arab. The Arab Spring is still actually going on, I believe. That is dangerous. Now, 30% by itself is not a terrifying figure, but the problem is have a look at the graph and watch the development. Not only has it increased a lot in the last couple of years, it seems to be it's almost accelerating in the last couple of years. This means for each barrel of oil used domestically, they have less oil for exports. And in addition, you have a growing population, which means even if you had a constant export level of oil, you would still have a decreasing oil export per capita level. Now, when you introduce the fact that they have less and less oil to export, the oil exports per capita ratio becomes horrific. Actually, this has already started to have its effect on Saudi Arabia. Adjusted for inflation, real GDP per capita was higher in the 80s than it is today. Now, it has rebounded a little bit from the lows in the 90s. Of course, the 90s were low because of the low oil prices. These figures or this development has a little bit been hidden by the fact that oil prices have been so high the last couple of years. But if nothing happens, if nothing is done, then we continue in their current trajectory. In 20 years, 30 years, they will of course have less and less and less. I mean, eventually they'll have no oil left for exports. And we're not talking 100 years or way in the future. We're talking a relatively short period of time. Already by 2020, this is going to be a problem. Currently, the break-even price for the government to run a budget surplus is $85. Not that long ago, that was 60, 50. So unless oil prices keep on rising, to the moon, which they won't, this is going to become a problem. One might think, I told you in the oil and gas presentation that they have 12.5 million barrels per day per capacity, and they have fields sort of ready and waiting to increase these to 15. Why don't they just increase to 15 and let the oil production increase with the population growth? It's not that simple. First of all, if they're a member of OPEC, they have production quotas. Saudi Arabia or individual countries just can't start ramping up production. If they did, of course, the oil price would start falling. So that's really increasing oil production, and it's not really a solution here. In this section, in the following parts, I'm going to discuss how has this happened, why are we where we are today, and also what are they planning to do with it.